Kale couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. He quickened his pace down the long, winding driveway, the sound of his shoes crunching against the gravel the only noise in the heavy silence of the night. The cool air brushed against his skin, but it did little to calm the unease gnawing at his insides. The manor, shrouded in the darkness of the night, loomed behind him like a specter, a place he knew he shouldn't return to, but a part of him felt as if it was calling him back. His hand instinctively went to his side, where the deep gash on his palm still throbbed, though it had stopped bleeding. The scent of his own blood lingered faintly in the air, but it was no longer as overpowering. Instead, the more he walked away from the manor, the more the unsettling sensation of being watched grew stronger. When he reached the edge of the estate, he stopped and looked back over his shoulder. The manor's windows were dark, but something in the stillness of the place made him feel as if it was alive, waiting. Waiting for him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. Kale pulled it out, his fingers trembling. It was an email from the museum, a confirmation of his assignment, the one he'd been dreading. He was to return to the manor in the coming days to catalog the rest of the artwork. The same artwork that had brought him here in the first place. The broken painting. The one that had set everything in motion. The email felt like a warning. Kale's gaze shifted to the horizon, where the moon hung in the sky like a silver eye, watching over the earth. He'd never believed in the supernatural, had always chalked up strange events to coincidence or his overactive imagination. But now, after encountering Davin, he wasn't so sure anymore. He took a deep breath, a reluctant decision forming in his mind. Despite everything that had happened, he couldn't escape the pull of the manor. It felt like unfinished business, like there was something more he needed to understand. The way Davin had looked at him, there had been recognition in his eyes. It had unsettled Kale, but it had also intrigued him in a way he couldn't explain. Against his better judgment, he turned and walked back toward the manor, his footsteps slower this time, as if he were walking toward an inevitable fate. As he reached the iron gates, his heart pounded. The air felt different now, charged with a strange energy. The wind whispered through the trees, but the sound seemed distant, almost muffled. Kale pushed open the gates, the creaking sound echoing in the empty night. He didn't know what he was expecting, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him. He entered the manor grounds again, the large stone steps leading up to the front door. He hesitated for a moment, glancing around the darkened courtyard, and then he found himself pushing the door open. The manor was as silent as ever, the air thick with an ancient stillness. The broken painting, its shattered frame, lay in the hallway, untouched since the last time Kale had seen it. His heart skipped a beat as he stepped closer to it. He couldn't remember exactly what had drawn him to it in the first place. Perhaps it was the way it seemed out of place among the other works of art, too perfect, too sharp, as if it held secrets within its colors. Kale knelt down, his fingers brushing against the shards of glass, a cold shiver running down his spine. His thoughts were interrupted by a low, almost imperceptible sound behind him. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Why did you come back?" The voice was calm, but it carried an undeniable weight. The sound of it seemed to reverberate in the room, making the air feel thicker, heavier. Kale's heart stuttered in his chest, and he slowly turned around to face Davin. He hadn't heard him enter, hadn't seen him move. The vampire was standing in the doorway, his dark silhouette framed by the faint glow of the hallway's lantern. His piercing gaze locked onto Kale's, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade around them. I don't know," Kale admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something feels wrong. I can't explain it. I don't know why I'm here." Davin took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving Kale's. "You should leave. You shouldn't have returned." But Kale didn't move. Instead, his curiosity got the better of him. What happened to you? How long have you been here? Davin's eyes flashed with something unreadable, a flicker of an emotion Kale couldn't place. Long enough to understand that you can't fight fate. You're here now, whether you want to be or not. Kale swallowed hard, his pulse quickening as a sudden understanding began to dawn on him. Fate? Davin nodded, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. Our paths have crossed before. And they will again. Whether you like it or not. Kale's breath caught in his throat as the pieces started to fall into place. He was connected to Davin somehow, he felt it deep in his bones. But how? I don't know what you're talking about, Kale murmured, the air around him thick with an unspoken tension. You will, Davin said softly. In time. Kale's confusion deepened, but the pull toward Davin only intensified. Something ancient, something primal stirred within him, an undeniable force he couldn't ignore. And for the first time in his life, Kale realized that he was standing at the edge of something far darker, and far more dangerous, than he had ever imagined. As Davin moved closer, his eyes glowing with a fierce hunger, Kale could only wonder how much of this was fate, and how much was the ancient thirst that had finally awoken in the vampire's veins. And, more importantly, how much of this was something they were both bound to face together. The room seemed to close in on Kale as Davin approached, his magnetic presence tugging at something deep within. Every nerve in Kale's body screamed for him to retreat, but his feet remained planted, drawn by a force he couldn't understand. His breath quickened, his pulse pounding in his ears. You've always been connected to this place, Davin said, his voice low and measured, carrying an eerie certainty. He stopped just inches away, his gaze piercing. The manor, the painting, the fragments, they've always been part of a larger truth. And so have you. Kale felt a shiver run through him. He wanted to deny it, but the words struck a chord too deep to ignore. The truth was tangled within him, just out of reach. I don't understand, he said softly, his voice betraying the confusion and fear swirling inside. You will, Davin murmured, his fingers brushing Kale's cheek with a tenderness that contradicted the heavy tension in the air. You've been here before, Kale. In another life, another time. And now, his voice dropped lower, a thread of darkness weaving through his tone. You're here again, where you belong. Kale's breath hitched. The connection between them felt ancient, undeniable, and yet cloaked in shadows. Follow me, Davin said, stepping back. The pull to follow was irresistible. Kale trailed him through the grand hallway, past doors that seemed to open on their own, until they reached a room at the end of the manor. The air felt heavier here, charged with an energy that set Kale's nerves alight. Davin stopped before an ornate mirror, its gilded frame gleaming even in the dim light. The surface was unnaturally clear, as though untouched by time. What is this? Kale asked, his voice barely above a whisper. This mirror, Davin said, reveals the past. It remembers what you've forgotten. Kale hesitated, but the mirror seemed to call to him, its surface rippling like water. Taking a deep breath, he stepped closer and looked into it. At first, he saw only his reflection. Then, the image began to shift. His own face twisted, morphing into someone both familiar and foreign. The room around him dissolved, replaced by a vision of another time. He was standing in the same manner, but it was brighter, alive with the hum of life. Beside him stood Davin, not as he was now, but younger, unguarded, his eyes shining with love. Kale saw himself reaching out, their hands clasping, their expressions filled with joy and devotion. Memories Kale didn't know he had flooded his mind. He saw himself and Davin walking through the manor's halls, laughing, sharing stolen moments under the moonlight. He felt the rush of love, the ache of loss, the sting of betrayal. And then, a moment froze in the mirror, a kiss shared in the dim glow of candlelight, their bond unbreakable. The vision shattered, and Kale stumbled back, gasping for air. His chest ached, the weight of the memories pressing down on him. What was that? He managed to ask, his voice trembling. Davin's gaze softened, filled with a sadness that mirrored Kale's own. That was us, Kale. A long time ago. Kale's hands shook as he looked back at the mirror. Why don't I remember? Because you chose to forget, Davin said quietly. The pain was too much, the loss unbearable. But the past doesn't stay buried forever. Kale's knees weakened, and he sank into a nearby chair. The emotions coursing through him were overwhelming, love, longing, and an ache so deep it felt like it might consume him. Davin knelt beside him, his voice low and steady. This is why you were drawn here. The manor, the memories, it's all part of who you are, who we were. But remembering comes with a price. What price? Kale whispered, his voice breaking. Davin's hand rested over Kale's, his touch grounding. The past has a way of reclaiming what it's lost. And now, it's calling you back. Kale looked at him, searching for answers in those dark, familiar eyes. And you've been waiting for me all this time. Davin nodded, his expression solemn. Centuries. And I would wait 1,000 more if it meant having you back. Tears blurred Kale's vision as the weight of Davin's words sank in. The pull of the past was undeniable, and for the first time, Kale felt the stirrings of recognition in his soul. Whatever lay ahead, he knew there was no turning back.